Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to week 8. Um, this particular video is going to be in association with, I think, Monday, the 18th of October. And just so we have some sense of perspective and where we're at in relation to where we're hopefully going, the next recording, which will be in association with Wednesday, obviously, 2 days hence, that'll take us to October 20th, I think, if this is for the 18th. Then that'll be October 20th. That will be 1 week prior to what I anticipate will be the due date for the next exam, i.e. exam number 2. This will all be perhaps known by you by the time that you actually are in receipt of this information or are watching this video, because I'm recording this on October 3rd, I think. Today's a Sunday. It's the 3rd, right? So this is 2 weeks ahead of where it's actually going to be by the time you actually get around to watching this, unless assuming you watched this before. But before I get into the substance of what I need to say today, I did spend about 30 minutes last time making as impassioned a plea as I was able to make on behalf of the interests of those of you who may not have actually conceivably invested as much time and effort and consideration to the last test as you probably should have. Which is to say that I went through and I adumbrated the various reasons why I think you ought to be applying yourselves more scrupulously and diligently and forthrightly in furtherance of achieving academic success in this class. Because after all, look, it really comes down to just exams, okay? And I made this point last time, but I will make it very briefly just one more time, just for the sake of all of you who didn't hear me the first time, or for the sake of those who heard me and forgot. This class is just about the exams. That's all it's about, right? It has nothing to do with anything else, okay? There's no homework. There's very little reading, right? The reading that I assign, I do myself, and I explain to you anyway, so it doesn't count. There's no group work. There's no presentations. There's no quizzes. There's no nothing, okay? It's just listen to this, listen to me. If you can bear to do that, right, for an hour, for 2 hours, for about 4 hours a week, right? That's the going rate. And take notes, right, and pay attention. And even if you don't even need to do that, right? I mean, that's the sort of the long way. That's if you actually do your due diligence. If you go about doing this the proper and the conventional and I think the scrupulous way, that would be what you ought to aspire to do. But look, there is a cheap and easy, there's a quick and dirty way. And of course, the quick and dirty way, I mean, I shouldn't perhaps be telling you this, but I tell my online students, so it would be perhaps unfair and inequitable for me not to tell you as well. The quick and the dirty way, if you haven't figured it out for yourselves, is just wait till the next test comes out, because you're going to have at least 10 days between the time the test comes out and the time the test is actually due, right? And hopefully that'll give you ample time to do what I'm going to tell you to do, which is to go look at the questions, right? And then try to navigate the YouTube videos, right? Just go through and peruse and scan, right? Just kind of select random places and see what I'm talking about at a given time. And then you can kind of triangulate, right? And see where I'm at relative to the material. And as I say, the questions on the test appear sequentially in chronology relative to when I actually cover this stuff in the course of my discussion of it throughout these lectures. Which is to say that what you really could do, right? And if I was an intellectually lazy student, I would probably do this myself, and I'm not recommending or advising any of you guys do this, because I can't recommend this to you because it would be unbecoming of me to do so as an instructor. But what you could conceivably very easily do, just go and find the answers in the YouTube videos. You don't need to listen to all this, okay? Maybe if you think that it's so much of an encumbrance, if you think it's a huge liability in terms of time and effort and investment, well, think of it this way: you'd be at the very least you'd be spending this amount of time, right? X hours a week, the equivalent of hours a week, just attending class. Which is to say nothing of all the other things, the ancillary things that would be taking up your time incidental to the attendance of class. Because you got to drive to campus and then back. You got to fill up your car, right? You got to get dressed, okay? You got to take a shower. You got to get things done in the bathroom in the morning, right? So there's all that. And I cut all that out. And that's the beauty, that's one of the geniuses of YouTube, I suppose, right? Or at least that's the merit of it, okay? It has many merits, but that's one of them. It's expedient, much more so than a physical class, I would argue, okay? Or so it would seem. So that's the thing that I'm telling you, so as to ameliorate the concerns of those of you who think as though this is some undue hardship. This class is unduly onerous, that it's just too much of an encumbrance. I don't know who could possibly think that, who could possibly reasonably, rationally logically and coherently maintain that position seems to me to be completely untenable and completely incongruous with the reality as it is. Okay. Today I want to talk about a few things. All right. And I don't know whether or not I'm going to go for an hour and 53 minutes. I'll be honest with you guys. I literally slept for I went to bed at around midnight last night, but I didn't fall asleep until literally 8 a.m. this morning. And I wasn't drunk, and I wasn't high, and I wasn't doing anything unseemly or shady or anything like that. I just couldn't sleep. I couldn't fall asleep. So I'm going on about 3.5 hours of sleep right now. I've already had a busy day. I actually fell, and you guys probably can't see this, but there's a big, huge series of bandages down my arm. I fell on my front porch today. I cut my arm up pretty bad. So I'm in moderate amount of pain. And therefore, this all sort of cuts in your favor because the likelihood of me actually being able to go for the full hour and 53 minutes is extremely small, I would say. And it's already going on 8 o'clock here, and I'm already exhausted. So maybe I'll start. I don't know. Maybe I'll be like a horse. I'll fall asleep as I'm talking. Right. Of course, horses don't do that unless, of course, it's the talking horse. Mr. Red. You guys are too young to remember that. A couple of things I want to do. First of all, I want to talk about the extra credit assignment. So by the time that you are watching this video, which will be around the second 2.5 week mark of October, give or take a couple of days, the 18th, whenever that's going to take you to, 2.5, it's almost 3 weeks, 2 weeks from tomorrow. By that time, you will have received an email, and that email will provide you with what I am holding, which is it's a Word document, and the Word document contains very express and very explicit and very unambiguous instructions regarding what you ought to do if, in fact, you are aspiring to earn extra credit in this class. Now, the first thing you need to understand about extra credit is, by definition, it is extra. It is gratuitous. It is, I don't want to say it's superfluous because that's a different thing, but it is gratuitous in the sense that it's above and beyond. You don't have to do it. It's not obligatory. It's not mandatory. It is optional. It is volitional. If you choose to do it, great. Okay. If not, that's fine too. I won't hold it against you. I don't care either way, right? As I say about a lot of things in this class, and I really do mean that. Okay, I mean, I care about what you say about me at the end of the day, and so I guess to a certain extent I care about what you think about me, because what you think about me is obviously going to modulate what you say about me or what you write about me during the evaluations, and hopefully nobody's going out there and talking too much smack about me on the streets. But that's okay, because I got my partisans out there and they're talking a lot of good things about me anyway, so it's to compensate for the trash talkers. But look, what I really do not care about, okay, well, I guess I'm being slightly disingenuous here to the facts, because I guess I sort of care about whether or not you do the extra credit. And the reason I say I sort of care about it is not because I personally have any genuine subjective interest in the disposition of your academic affairs. That's entirely your prerogative. But I would say this. It seems to me to be a tremendous waste if, in fact, you are somebody who is precariously situated on the brink of a D, or especially on the brink of an F. And I don't know how many of you are going to be, well, it's the same number of people who are so situated right now, because the second exam will not have yet transpired when I'm actually, by the time you actually get around to watching this video. So at least one, possibly two of you, at least, yeah, two of you, all right? Two of you should at least right now, as things stand, as you are situated in relation to the course, you ought to very seriously contemplate undertaking to complete the extra credit assignment. Now, all of you should also give serious consideration to this for a couple of reasons. I'm going to spare you guys a very long-winded, extensive speech about this. Maybe I'll say something about this in the email that I send out, but probably not, because this is really, as I said, this is up to you, okay? If you choose to do it, great. If not, that's fine too. The reasons as to why you ought to do it. First of all, it represents a substantial opportunity to improve your status vis-a-vis this course. I'm giving you that which no other instructor to my knowledge has ever given. Well, maybe I don't know about them, but very few that I'm aware of, okay, very few that I've ever heard of, and certainly none that I've actually personally experienced as a student, have given this abundance of points, this cornucopia of points in relation to the overall point value of the course. I'm going to weigh this assignment, and I haven't done the math on this. I haven't run the numbers. I haven't figured out exactly how many points are going to be associated with this course. But when I do that, if it's 500 points, let's say, 50 of those points will be, 50 of those points will be, or 50 points, not 50 of those points, but 50 points above and beyond on top of the 500, right? Because you could earn the 100% of the conventional points, and then plus whatever the surplus is associated with the extra credit. That's why I call it gratuitous. But 50 of those points will consist in the extra credit assignment, which means, I can't put my arm there because my arm is in pain, which means that, think about this, the extra credit assignment represents a possible 10% of your cumulative overall grade. right? So of course the inference is that if you are at a mid B, let's say you're at 85%, right? And conceivably you could earn all the credit associated with the extra credit assignment. You go from an 85% to a 95% just by doing this, okay, right? Assuming you maintain the continuous trajectory that you're at, academically speaking, right? You don't go down substantially, you don't go up substantially. All other things being equal, right? You would go from a B to an A, all right? Now that seemed to me to be extremely generous. I don't have to give you an extra credit assignment at all, but I do, and I give you a lot of time to work on it, right? By the time this video comes out, that'll be the end of October. You have over a month to get this done. I think I said until the last week in November. Oh no, it's Wednesday, November 24th. All right. And if you are that interested in doing this, print off the Word document, beseech the directions, read them very carefully. They are not precisely concise, but they are concise enough. And more importantly, they're very explicit as to what you need to do. Now, why is this extra credit assignment rather unconventional? Well, I used to give an extra credit assignment which just entailed going out there, watching a movie or a television series or even playing a video game that happened to relate in some meaningful way to the substance of this course. And then you went out there and you watched, I don't know, I'm trying to think, the Count of Monte Cristo, for example, right? Or Waterloo would be a better example. Waterloo, the movie about one of the final battles in the Napoleonic Wars. And you told me whether or not Rod Steiger, who played Napoleon in that movie, did a pretty good job of representing what Napoleon was really like at that time, based on our understanding of who Napoleon was as a person. And so you juxtapose and you reconcile the narrative features, the perhaps quasi-historical features of the film or the television series or the video game with the actual real tangible history as we understand it, okay? And so I'm looking for you to, and this is option number one. I still offer this, right? So for those of you who like an old school sort of traditional extra credit assignment that does have some relevance to what we're actually talking about this class, by all means pursue option number one, okay? That's the conventional option. All right, it is an opportunity. Nevertheless, they're both equal in terms of value, right? It's not like one is worth more than the other. Option one and option two, they're both worth the same points. They both present you with the opportunity to increase your grade by 10 percentage points in this class. I actually think option number two is perhaps more salacious and more enticing, and for that reason, perhaps more viable. But I'm going to get to that here in a minute. But option one is just basically go out there and tell me the extent to which, ideally, a film. All right, I'm not saying that you necessarily need to watch a film, but I think the film is probably the easiest because it lends itself to a more holistic analysis, which can be kept reasonably within the confines, the narrative confines of the film, as it starts at a particular point and it ends at a particular point. A video game would be hard to do. Television series would require you to watch a lot of episodes. That don't do that. Do a film. And if you don't know which movies to watch because you don't know which films are out there that actually bear on or relate materially to the substance of this class, come and talk to me because you guys know I've seen every movie known to man, every movie ever produced since the history of cinema has ever been established, right? I mean, they're almost thereabouts, not quite, but almost, right? Not including the Fast and Furious. I will not watch any of those. And if I did, you'd have every right to think less of me. You'd think that well, I don't want to denigrate anybody who likes the Fast and Furious because maybe there's some Vin Diesel fans out there. I don't know. What about option two? Option two, it seems to me, is much more enticing. And the reason I say that is because option two is very open-ended. Okay, the way I look at this class is to say that I don't want to say anything goes, but I try to make this class as interdisciplinary as I possibly can. I try to approach this class in as holistic a manner as possible, which is to say that if things have tangential relationship to the primary themes of what it is I'm talking about, then I will try to incorporate those other ancillary things as they relate vicariously to the substance of what we're talking about at any given time. Right? We talked a lot about law. We talked a lot about philosophy. We talked a lot about economics, economic history. We talked a lot about other subjects that aren't generally, not always exclusively, associated fall under the rubric of history always categorically, right? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, right? I try to throw in as much as I possibly can, right? And because I subject you guys to that sort of meandering sort of analysis, which tends to go down into these various different tangents, and it tends to adduce material which isn't precisely probative to a lot of these questions that we're trying to resolve for ourselves. Well, therefore, it would be extremely unbecoming of me not to allow you to also partake in some tangential undertaking, tangential as it stands in relation to the material associated with this course. And so therefore, hence I arrive at option two. Option 2 of the extra credit, as I said, is the same in all of the respects. It takes the same form, right? And by the way, for those of you who don't like to follow directions, for those of you who didn't really pay attention to what I said in the directions section on test number 1, and you just went ahead and modified that document because you thought that a 9-point font type looked better when you submitted that as opposed to 11-point font type. I don't know why you did what you did, but some of you did. Don't do that, all right? Don't do that for the extra credit assignment, right? Understand that I don't have to give you any points for this at all. I don't even have to give you an extra credit opportunity, but I'm giving you that, right? And so therefore, it becomes incumbent upon you to make sure that you are in maximum conformity with the expectations, because even the most minor deviation represents a substantial departure from my expectations with respect to what it is I'm asking you to do on the extra credit assignment. So therefore, make sure if you do it right, and you do it right all the way, not just a little bit, not just part of the way, not just most of the way, but all the way. Now, what is option 2? Option 2 entails you going out there, starting off with the incipient question, which has to be, what discipline besides history, right, beyond the scope of history, what discipline appeals to my intellectual sensibilities? What discipline, and by discipline I just mean areas, topics, subjects of study, right? Formal academic subjects that are susceptible to being investigated and researched and evaluated and empirically assessed, right? The kinds of things that we learn within the scope of our college experiences, right? Those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Now, I do stipulate one caveat, and the caveat is this. It has to be a particular discipline which I myself feel sufficiently conversant in or fluent with or intelligible in terms of my knowledge of it, so that I can actually coherently and authoritatively evaluate the contents of the paper that you submit to me. So I don't want people going in and telling me about microbiology, right? I'm trying to think of, well, Pythagorean theory, all right? You know, there was this guy Pythagoras, and he had this particular theory, and it had a lot to do with geometry. Don't tell me about that, because I don't know anything about geometry, and I don't know anything about math. So what I do say is that there are certain disciplines beyond the scope, beyond the academic rubric of history, that do sort of fall under the purview of my knowledge, my personal knowledge as it relates to matters beyond history. And of course, you can start with the things that I teach, right? Because I also teach, in addition to history, I teach political science. So if you want to go out there and you want to evaluate the constitutionality of certain gun laws that are out there that restrict gun ownership in the state of California, per se, right? You want to evaluate the constitution of gun laws and reconcile that with the Heller case, right? So there's a case, Heller, comes out of the United States Supreme Court. I think before that was in the 10th Circuit. And it's a federal case, and I think the majority opinion was written by Justice Scalia, Antonin Scalia, a great moral and intellectual hero of mine, great guy. May he rest in peace. Requiesce in pace. I'm saying that wrong. This is what happens when you sleep for 3 hours. You can't speak Latin anymore. Well, you could go out there, you could tell me about the Heller case, right? And what it said about handgun ownership in the District of Columbia, and how it placed how the law there placed certain impediments to accessing the handgun and so on and so forth, and why it was legal or why it was illegal, and what the ruling was in that particular case, and how that has relationship to understanding modern day gun laws as they are imposed upon us by the national legislature, the Congress, right, or the state legislature down there in Lansing, right? You could do that, for instance, right? Now, that's a political science topic, okay? There's a lot of things that fall under the rubric of political science. I'm just giving you an example, right? Constitutional law is definitely fair game, all right? I love the Constitution. I love the law, right? I love interpreting cases. If you want to tell me about case law, by all means, please do so. I would love you for it, all right? And I would be very much encouraged, very much inclined to try to contrive to look at your assignment in such a way so that it will allow me to actually award you the full value of the points associated with this extra credit if you go out there and you write about a case. Right? Now you have to do a hell of a good job, right? A hell of a good job interpreting Heller, right? Heller, you get it, right? Or you don't have to do that, right? What else could you do? Well, criminal justice, for instance, right? What about that? You could tell me about broken windows theory, okay? Which is a theory that it's an environmental theory of crime. It stipulates that if you don't take care of your property and your property becomes debilitated and it starts to degrade aesthetically, then people are going to look at that and they're going to have, just the general public is going to have less regard for maintaining the good aesthetic quality of the environment, because they see that you, the owner of that stuff, doesn't care enough to actually maintain your own property. So why should they? Right? And then that leads to the sort of degeneration. It's sort of a domino effect and it leads sequentially to the degeneration of the neighborhood entirely, which results in urban decay, which results in the diminution in property value, which results in the depreciation in terms of the economic quality of the people who are actually domiciled there, the demographic quality, you could say, from an economic standpoint, which results in predisposing the community to a much greater likelihood of criminality. Right now, that's just my elucidation of one particular criminological theory. You guys can go out there and write anything. You can talk about anything under the sun as it relates to criminal justice. Right? I know this stuff. I actually have a formal education in this. I spent more years learning about criminal justice than I have about any other discipline, formally, anyways, in terms of formal education. So I know my shit when it comes to CJ, as they call it. Right? Go out there and write anything about that. Right? And I will grade that and I will evaluate that too. Other things that I don't have, well, law, all right? I know a lot about the law. I don't have a law degree, but I have at least half a law degree, right? So I understand the law, right? So you can go out there, and this goes back to political science. My political science example was actually a pretty bad example because it actually can be used as a law example, a legal example. A political science example, you could talk about how there's a partisan inflection to how we interpret things like global climate change, the efficacy of the vaccine, the viability of COVID. Is it actually a pathogen that warrants our concern and our consideration? Because all of these things have a partisan inflection. What do I mean by that? Well, depending on which side of the aisle you sit on, whether you're a leftist or whether you're a rightist, whether you're liberal or whether you're conservative, your perception of the importance of the vaccine is going to be a function of how you perceive things through your ideological lens. It ought not be that way, but unfortunately it is. This is the world in which we live. Climate change is the same thing, right? Abortion rights. You want to now that's something you could tell me all about in political science, right? Now that's something that's actually ongoing right now. There's a law in the books in Texas, right? That has the legality of it, the underlying constitutional lawfulness of it has been authenticated by the Supreme Court. Now, of course, there are going to be other attacks on this law based on disparate treatment, based on violation of the 14th Amendment, based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, based on all other sorts of constitutional considerations. But right now, it's on the books and it stands, right? And it's basically a law that makes it very, very difficult. It places considerable pragmatic encumbrances to getting an abortion in the state of Texas. So you have a sort of an abortion exodus of young ladies who are going out to Arkansas and Oklahoma and, I don't know, New Mexico, whatever the surrounding states are around there. And they're going to those other states, those more liberal states, which allow them to operate abortion clinics. Tell me all about that if you want. What about other disciplines? What other disciplines that you may gravitate towards? And what do I mean by that? Look, I mean that these are things that I'm giving you guys the opportunity to potentially explore topics that could conceivably lead you to investigate something more seriously and perhaps actually immerse yourself in it formally in an academic program of study. This is an opportunity to go out there and get to know about something that you're interested in and you want to learn more about, and perhaps that's something that you actually want to consider devoting a good portion of your energy and your intellectual efforts and perhaps even your life to. So this is an opportunity to learn about yourself. It's introspective, right? And that's why I think that this is a great opportunity. It's not just a great opportunity in terms of practical implication that you could actually increase your cumulative grade in this class by 10%. That's good, right? That's very good, right? But it's also an opportunity to learn something about yourself. So I think for that reason, it has an intrinsic sort of connotation to it, and I think that that's a good thing also in and of itself. So what else could you write about? I got this assignment here and I'm holding it and I haven't really even looked at it the entire time. So I guess I better look at this and see what other options I'm giving you. Philosophy, right? I love philosophy. You guys know that because I've been talking about that. I spent almost 2 hours talking about that last time. I'm going to spend, I don't know how much more time I'm going to spend talking about any of this stuff because I'm getting really, really tired here, but I'm going to talk about philosophy a little bit today, all right? So if you want to write about the philosophical writings of Plato or Aristotle, all right, some of the Greek philosophers, you can write about Euclid, you could write about, I don't know, Marcus Aurelius, right? I've got his Meditations. I carry it around with me. In fact, the Meditation was a book by this guy. Marcus Aurelius was one of the emperors of Rome. So he has historical significance, but I think even more so, he has philosophical significance because he was one of the great Stoics. He was a great Stoical philosopher. I got a lot of quotes from Marcus Aurelius rolling around in my head. My favorite one is he says, "Nothing happens to any man." Of course, by man he means mankind, so inclusive of ladies. Nothing happens to any man or any woman for that matter, which he or she is not fitted by nature to bear. Okay, think about that, right? Nothing happens to any man which he is not fitted by nature to bear. What's old Imperator Augustus Marcus Aurelius saying? Well, he's saying that we have it. We are prepossessed of the natural faculties of our humanity, our intellectual faculties, our resilience, our wherewithal, our natural capacity to evolve and to meet various challenges and to endure various physical encumbrances and pain and suffering and emotional discontentment and all sorts of things. We have that in us, right? So there's nothing that can conceivably happen to you in this world which would cause you to be challenged in such a way so that you didn't have the incipient capacity or capability to actually deal with that thing and manage it on the basis of who you are as a person, as you are constituted as a human being, right? That's the point he's trying to make. Now, I would say I'm not sure about that when you actually think about all the nefarious things that you could be subjected to. What if you're abducted and you're tortured and you're subjected to all kinds of, you know, the horrible, excruciating tortures? Would you be able to endure that? Right? Nothing happens to any man which is not fitted by nature to bear. Would you be able to bear that? Would nature have predisposed you to be able to make those kinds of accommodations? I don't know. It's an interesting argument. But hey, if you want to write about that, if you want to make that argument to me, by all means, please do so. I love philosophy. I love the dialectical aspect of it. Right? Go back and forth, make the argument on both sides, and then you adjudicate that, and I'll tell you whether or not I think you did a good job. Astronomy. All right, I love astronomy. I'm absolutely fascinated with the cosmos. As in the words of Gene Roddenberry, all right, the guy behind Star Trek, space is the final frontier. It really is. It used to be the wilderness, right? It used to be the West, the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades and the Alaskan mountains, right? That's no longer the case. So I think you could write about astrophysics if you want, right? Write about the theories, the astrophysical theories of Stephen Hawking's, right? And how he developed and elucidated string theory, right, which deals with the very, very large. It deals with the macrocosmic principles. Or you could talk about quantum theory, which deals with the very, very small, right? And particles, individual particles of matter, behave very erratically, very counterintuitively, when they're very, very small, right? These small sort of subparticles can behave in a manner that's completely inconsistent with our physical understanding of the universe. The laws of the universe are not quite negated, because you can't by definition negate the laws of the universe, but there are certain caveats when it comes to very, very small quantum things, right? So tell me about that. Go out there and learn about that. Another example that I give, which I also am fascinated with, is severe weather meteorology. I like severe weather. I used to say I love tornadoes, but then people thought that I had this sort of perverse desire to go out there and see tornadoes destroy things and kill people. That's not true. I'm not a sadist. I completely disclaim that, right? But I'm fascinated by tornadoes. And if you think that tornadoes are interesting, and I think at least one of you said that you found tornadoes to be slightly interesting, then go out there and write about one of the, well, this actually combines meteorology with history. Right? Go out there and write about some of the most major, most destructive, most lethal, most catastrophic tornado outbreaks in the history of the United States. Right? Write about the super outbreak of 2011, April 26th, April 25th, April 26th, and April 27th of 2011. April 27th was one of the most catastrophic days for tornado casualties and destruction in terms of billions of dollars of damage and destruction inflicted upon mostly Alabama, but also Mississippi. There was an F5 in Smithville, Mississippi, absolutely cataclysmic. Right, literally ripped storm shelters, subterranean storm shelters, dislodged them from their foundations, dislodged concrete porches, and literally ripped them from their moorings. Imagine the power and the ferocity and the intensity of the wind to be able to do that. That, to my mind, is a testament to the overwhelming power, the awe, and the majesty of nature. And if you don't have reverence for God, if you don't have an appreciation for God, at the very least, even as a secular humanist, as an atheist, you can have a reverence and an appreciation for the numinous, the transcendent, the power, the sheer physical power and the majesty of nature. And I think this is an opportunity for you to go out there and get more acquainted with that. So go out there and tell me all about the super outbreak. Or hey, we had an F5, which is the highest rating that tornadoes can achieve before before the imposition of the enhanced Vegeta scale. We had an F5 down in Flint, actually, in Beecher, which is a suburb, northern suburb of Flint. You drive to 75, the I-75, you go right by Coldwater Road. in Coldwater Road was the east-west axis where this F5 tornado traveled along back in 1953. I think it was in June 1953. It was the most catastrophic tornado we've ever had in the history of Michigan. One of only 2 F5s that have ever hit this state. Interesting, fascinating stuff. Learn about meteorology. Learn about the state history. Learn about just how deadly and destructive some of these tornadoes were. And learn something about tornado safety while you're at it. Not that that's important for you guys living in the UP, but you never know. Maybe you'll end up in Oklahoma. Who knows? Okay. Make sure that you use footnotes or you use citations, but I want to make sure that you are utilizing a system, a reference system. And references are just a way for me to authenticate that you're actually relying upon information, some kind of data, right? Because this is all an empirical undertaking, right? It's you going out there and investigating these various intellectual questions, these various academic questions that appeal to your sensibilities, but doing so on the basis of information that is available to you, right? And I recommend to you that you can go to certain websites. I wouldn't recommend necessarily Wikipedia, but you don't necessarily avoid Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia can be a means to an end, right? Wikipedia is not an end in and of itself. You can use Wikipedia to go down to the very bottom of Wikipedia, and then you can look at a very well-written article. It's usually going to be a very well-referenced article and an article which has many citations. Go down to the bottom, look at the footnotes, and then look at the URLs, look at the links that they have. And those will lead mostly to .edu or .gov websites, either affiliated with institutions of higher learning, such as Harvard, Princeton, Yale, or even Gogobec, who knows, right? Or .gov, in that instance, it's associated with the federal government, right? In either case, it's generally going to be a pretty reliable source of information which has a great deal of factual veracity to it. As always, all right, I'm done with that, okay? But as always, if you guys got any questions concerning the extra credit, you know how to get a hold of me. Please don't hesitate. Please don't be in any way abashed or intimidated, because this is an opportunity for you to earn massive amounts of points. All right, let's turn to the dichotomy that I was trying to draw, to delineate between conservatism and liberalism, and the incipient sort of origins of these two vastly different philosophies, these two vastly different worldviews. And I started by setting this up by saying that if you are a conservative, you have sort of innate predisposition to look at the world in a more cynical manner. And because you are cynical, because you distrust the intrinsic good in humanity, because you think that humanity is not intrinsically good, either you think that it is intrinsically bad because you embrace the assertions of Hobbes, not Calvin and Hobbes, but rather Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes came along and he said that human nature is fundamentally flawed, right? The fall of man, okay? Remember the fall of man, right? And we are sinful creatures. And not only that, we are animals, right? We are animals, and therefore we are given to follow our own impulses, our own instincts, our own ingrained whatever those inclinations may be, and act those out. And it is only because of society, and only because of the laws and the order and the structure and the hierarchy of the state, which is able to ensure that it safeguards the collective interests of society, the people, the vox populi, the citizenry as a whole, against the voracious sort of predatory instincts of certain members of society, the sociopaths and the psychopaths. But of course, Hobbes presupposes that most people, if in fact there is no governing dynamic in society, there is no law, there is no police, there is no enforcement mechanism, then most people are going to revert back to what he refers to as a state of nature. That's a very bad thing, because that results in all manner of barbarism, because that incipiently is who we are, humanity, people as a species. We are bestial, we are impulsive, we are instinctual, right? Basic instinct. Remember that movie that I told you not to watch because it's got all kinds of explicit nudity in it, and it's very bad for the corruption of young minds such as yourselves, right? But basic instinct, right? That's what Hobbes is all about. He's saying basic instincts. We want to kill, we want to rape, we want to murder, we want to abuse, we want to torture, we want to do all sorts of nefarious things. And therefore, the state needs to be powerful. The state needs to be powerful, and it is to have absolute power so as to adjudicate these matters in as efficient a manner as possible, so as to constrain us from acting out on our more base and impulsive, our bestial instincts, our primal impulses, and the impetuosity which would otherwise be unrestrained by the laws of man. Now, that's conservatism. What about liberalism? Well, liberalism starts with this guy by the name of Montesquieu, all right? And many of these guys are French, right? And that's okay. We're not going to hold it against them because they're French. We're not going to hold them against France because they happen to be philosophical in their thinking. It's just the way it is. And Montesquieu was a lawyer, amongst other things. He was a lawyer, he was a philosopher, and he advocated the notion, which was a very original notion at this time, of the separation of powers. Right? Remember, this is the 18th century. Okay, this is probably in the middle late 18th century, but this is before or around the same time as the codification of these principles in the context of the United States Constitution, right? So much of this philosophical thinking actually predates the Constitution. In fact, many of the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, as they're referred to in the law, right? The framers of the Constitution, many of those guys were actually genuinely, authentically, intellectually inspired by the ideas of people like Montesquieu and Rousseau, right? They liked what they heard. They liked what they read, right? And Montesquieu comes along and he says, we need to have a separation of powers. We need to have a separate judiciary. We need to have a separate executive, and we need to have a separate legislative branch. And that is important because otherwise, if you consolidate all of those powers in a singular unitary executive, well, then it gets to be an untenable, precarious position for the people because their liberties become a liability for the state. Because the state wants to amass as much power unto itself as possible, and it doesn't want to have respect and regard and preserve the integrity of the civil liberties and the human rights of its citizenry. And so, therefore, it's in the interest of the citizens and as the representative members of the state, the constituent members of the state, so as to insist upon a separation of powers so that no one single government, whether it's a unitary autocratic monarch or whether it's just a very strong executive, no one single form of government can predominate and supersede the others. And this is the incipient origins of the idea of having checks and balances whereby you have restrictions and restraints upon what the executive branch can do, and it's held accountable to the adjudications of the courts, and it's held accountable to the interpretation of the law by the judiciary, and it's certainly also, in some ways, it's beholden to the legislative branch because the legislative branch, after all, is the one that promulgates the laws to begin with, right? So this is very important stuff, and this is the kind of information that is later embraced and codified in constitutions, both in France as well as in the United States. So, what else? Well, the other thing that Montesquieu advocated for was this notion of due process of law. Right now, some of you have heard of this term. It's kind of a vague, amorphous concept, but it has a great deal of salience and a great deal of significance and meaning in the context of jurisprudence. But it's also important from a philosophical standpoint because what is due process? Well, think about the term. What does due process imply? What does that seem to imply when I say due process? Well, it just means that we are going to ensure that the processes which result in the adjudication of your guilt are in accordance with certain procedural safeguards, so that we're not going to allow your rights as a citizen to be arbitrarily infringed upon by either the executive in its desire to enforce the laws or the judiciary in its desire to actually determine the extent to which you are culpable for certain violations of the law, right? Which is to say that you are going to be adjudged by a fair and dispassionate and objective and impartial adjudicator of the law, either a judge or a jury of your peers, right? This is part and parcel of due process, right? We're not going to subject you to all sorts of tortures and waterboarding and electroshock therapy and things like this. This is the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. I can't help but I relate this stuff to the Constitution because a lot of what is actually codified in the Constitution is in many ways representative of the kinds of ideas that were being bantered about in this particular time in the philosophical writings and speakings of people like Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau and other various French philosophers and people elsewhere as well, not just in France, but especially in France. And so that's what due process is, right? It's a guaranteed safeguard. The state is going to ensure that your liberties, your civil liberties, your civic liberties as a citizen are going to be protected against the arbitrary infringement by the courts or by the executive or even conceivably by the legislature, right? It's more likely that the courts or the executive are going to infringe upon your rights because they're the enforcers of the law and the interpreters of the law, respectively. So due process did not exist before the French Revolution, right? So a lot of these philosophical ideas are either a direct function, at least their promulgation, their instrumentalization, their operationalization, they're coming into effect, right? They're coming into effect. They're being consummated pragmatically anyways, is a function of the French Revolution. The ideas may have been around for a while, but they hadn't actually been embraced. They hadn't actually been codified in the laws and embraced in constitutional writings until such time as the Revolution came along and said, this is interesting, this whole due process of law concept, because it actually harkens back to an idea that's very, very old. This idea goes all the way back to Magna Carta, right? Runnymede, King John, having to be forced to sign this with the barons, right? The English barons. Now, the Magna Carta predates all of this. It predates all of this by about 600, about 500, about 600 years, give or take, right? 600 years, about 600 years, yeah. 1200, so right around the turn of the 13th century. But Magna Carta was the first attempt to essentially say that we are going to protect the laws, we are going to protect the rights of the peasants, we're going to protect them from arbitrary infringement by the nobles. And so I think that this philosophical thinking is the culmination of a long series of thought processes, which goes back, which harkens all the way back, and is nostalgic for really the one of the foundational documents of Western civilization, which of course is the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta just means, it's Latin for the Great Charter, right? The Great Writ, okay? And it gives people certain protections that they didn't otherwise have before. Let's talk about Voltaire. So Voltaire is a progressive thinker, and all these guys are progressive thinkers, right? Meaning that they advocate for principles, philosophical principles, which both presuppose that humanity is fundamentally good and operate in furtherance of that basic presupposition. Because you can't really get these theories, you can't get this notion of due process of law, or you wouldn't naturally arrive at that particular conclusion and say that is essential, but for the fact that you assume that human beings are fundamentally good, and that we have this sort of intrinsic good, altruistic value about us that is inseparable from our being humans. And therefore, you have to ensure that we are being protected, because there is something worth protecting, right? There's the intrinsic value of human life. There's the sovereignty of mankind's inviolable nature, right? Inviolable nature means you can't put your hands on me unless the law says, hey, you've infringed upon the interests of civil society, and therefore we're going to issue a warrant for your arrest, and then we're going to go out there, we're going to interdict you, we're going to bring you, we're going to apprehend you, so on and so forth. But it's this idea that we don't just go out there and arbitrarily infringe upon the rights of other human beings. It's essentially a reiteration of the golden rule, right? I am not going to do unto somebody else which I would find to be repugnant to my own sensibilities if in fact it was inflicted upon me. Or putting it the other way around, do unto others as you would hope others will do unto you, right? Now that seems to me is one of the fundamental operating assumptions of progressivism, not just at this particular juncture in time, but also I think at all times, in all places, in all ways. It really meaningfully is. It does assume those things. So Voltaire comes along and he says that Enlightenment principles are a good thing in and of themselves. Enlightenment, knowledge for its own sake, ipso facto, is a good thing. And the reason he thinks that is because he thinks that human beings, well, there's a couple of reasons. He thinks that because fundamentally human beings have the capacity to understand important insights, derive important insights from from complex philosophical abstractions, right? We can take and we can understand, we can engage with the philosophical writings of Plato, for instance, right? Or Marcus Aurelius, or whoever, right? Ancient philosophers. And if you make that information accessible to the common man, he first of all has a thirst for knowledge. He has a yearning for information. He wants to understand. He wants to apprehend and more fully appreciate his environment. Okay, so that appeals to his intrinsic curiosity. Right, so that's therefore enlightenment is a good thing, because it appeases, or it satisfies, or it satiates the hunger that is incipient in all of us for information and wisdom, and we want to become more sagacious and knowledgeable, and become more learned and erudite about the world around us. That's the assertion, anyways, right? That's the argument that is being made by Voltaire. And secondly, it says that we humanity, we both men and women, of all races and of all colors and of all creeds, right? And this is one of the fundamental tenets of progressivism as well, is that mankind, people are not really created differently, right? You could say, well, there are differences in terms of aptitudes, but there's not too much of a difference. And not only that, but we all have the capacity, we all have the fundamental ability to interpret and understand complex philosophical abstractions, to interpret those and to make some meaningful sense of those ideas as they apply to our particular lives, and then embrace and assimilate those concepts, and then go forward and become a better person as a result of that. Now, that's the argument. I'm not saying that I personally am of this particular conviction. I'm not saying that I recommend this to you because I think that it's right. I'm just saying that this is what Voltaire was advocating for. And he says that, therefore, we as society should maximize the availability of information and knowledge. That people should go out there and people should be learned. They should be erudite. They should go out there and immerse themselves in the writings of the ancient philosophers and learn as much as they possibly can. Because becoming a more knowledgeable person, becoming a more informed person, is being a person who is more able to make decisions on the basis of the information that you have, because it alleviates the ignorance that is innate to you as a human being. Now that actually does resonate with me, okay? And this perhaps goes back to my leaning in a more conservative direction in just in general. My subjective personal interpretation of the stuff ascribes greater value and probative weight to the conservative interpretation. But if you presuppose, as conservatives do, that human beings are fundamentally bad because we are inclined to pursue our own instincts and our own impulses, and they're always going to be selfish, right? That's the selfish gene theory. I want to go out there and propagate and advance my own genetics to the detriment of everybody else, because I don't care what happens to other people. All I care about is my capacity to go out there and to commandeer a suitable breeding mate so as to propagate my genetic code into the gene pool. That's the basic fundamental assumption. Now reconcile that, right? And reconcile all the implications that flow from that, which is to say, well, that's basically social Darwinism, or it precipitates a scenario whereby you have a form of social Darwinism whereby people are brutalizing others to get ahead, to take advantage, to exploit scarce resources, to acquire the sorts of means that they need to have at their disposal to ensure that their genes are propagated, right? If you presuppose all that, which you can still do that, right? What you're essentially saying is that mankind, the flaw of mankind, is going back to conservative ideology, right? The flaw of mankind is that we're primal, we're instinctual, right? The things that make us bad are the things that are what is essentially fundamentally intrinsically true about who we are, because we are animals, right? We have these animalistic predilections. We have this basic instinct to go out there and to kill and to rape and to steal and to do all these various bad things because we are selfish. Now, take that, right? And then juxtapose that with what Voltaire is saying, that education is a good thing in and of itself, because education allows for enlightenment, and enlightenment allows for a greater appreciation of our perspective in relation to the rest of humanity, and that will be conducive to the flourishing of society as a whole, because more people will have a greater appreciation for the other people around them, because they will be able to see things and appreciate and commiserate and therefore understand. Now, does that make sense? When you try to juxtapose that with the underlying presuppositions of the conservatives, I think it makes perfect sense, actually, right? So I don't want to say we can have it both ways, therefore, because not both sides can't both simultaneously be right about this. But I think that Voltaire makes a very good point in that you can say that philosophical learning, right, and whether it's the philosophy of moral philosophy, whether it's philosophy of religion, whether it's what they used to call the physical, what was it called? Well, natural philosophy is what they refer to it as, which is basically the physical sciences. It doesn't matter, right? Being an educated person is being a more learned person, is being a more enlightened person, and it therefore follows that if you are enlightened, you are alleviating the natural ignorance which is innate to you, right? Because that is what we are endowed with by virtue of just being human beings, being animals. We are endowed with ignorance. And ignorance, if we just continue to proceed on the basis of our ignorance, we don't really understand the import and the implications and the consequence and the significance, the moral ramifications of what we do. But Voltaire says the more enlightened you are, the more likely you are to look at somebody else, and before you brutalize that man and take his woman and rape her and try to propagate with her, right? Or steal his plow, or steal his horse, or abscond with his children, and whatever you're going to do, right? Before you brutalize somebody, before you infringe upon the rights of somebody else, if you are an enlightened person, you will probably be restrained. You will probably give greater consideration to the significance, the consequences, the deleterious consequences which will flow from those acts which are born about as a consequence of your just being an impulsive and impetuous and bestial and instinctual sort of primal creature. Now, I think that actually does make sense. That philosophical enlightenment serves to modulate and restrain our inner primal impulses in a way that philosophy civilizes us. It makes us more urbane. urbane and cosmopolitan, right? That erudition and learning is good, not just for its own sake, but because it mollifies, it conciliates, it serves to ameliorate some of these more bestial impulses which result in violent predilections. So I think that that's the point that Voltaire was making. Now, why therefore is all of this in many ways antithetical to the conservative position? Because conservatism is all about the preservation, the maintenance of the authority of institutions. Remember that, right? There were certain institutions: the monarchy, the aristocracy, the military, and especially the Catholic Church. What do those things, especially the Catholic Church, but I think the monarchy and certainly the aristocracy, perhaps not the military, but the aristocracy, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church, what do they all have in common? Well, you could say, well, they're institutions. They've been around for a very long time. They have traditions. They have a heritage. They have a history. It's important to perpetuate the legacy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. All the sorts of things you said last time. Yes, 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 yes. All that is true, right? But what else is true about them? What else is true about them that makes them in many ways anathema, right? Opposed, very strongly opposed to the philosophical implications which arise from or flow out of some of the presuppositions that Voltaire is making here about being enlightened and being a better person because you're a more knowledgeable person. Well, does the Catholic Church in France or in Europe more broadly, more generally at this time, does the Catholic Church, do you think, based on your understanding of Catholicism, maybe you're not very well equipped to actually answer this question, but did Catholicism really emphasize the importance of going out there for the people, the common people? Did it really emphasize the importance of the common people acquiring a great deal of knowledge and learning Latin and learning Greek and being able to interpret the scriptures for themselves? No, no. That's what the Protestant Reformation was all about, right? The Protestants were protesting the fact that Catholicism was in many ways rather idiosyncratic and rather hypocritical, because the Catholic Church wanted to have it, the Catholic priests anyways wanted to have it both ways, in that they wanted to have their women and their wives and their boats and hoes, right? They wanted to be able to engage in all manner of sinfulness, but also have the right, the moral prerogative to tell their sheep, right, their parishioners, to not do any of those things, because that was an infringement upon the law of God, and therefore you are damned, and therefore your mortal soul is in jeopardy, and so on and so forth. Right? Well, that is having it both ways. So the Catholic Church was in many ways, its power was essentially predicated on the continued maintenance of the ignorance and the superstition of the peasants of Europe. Because the more ignorant the peasants are, the less they really understand about the physical universe, the laws of nature, the laws of the universe which govern what actually happens around us, whether it's the geological forces, right, the volcanoes and the earthquakes and things like that, or whether it's the meteorological forces, right, the earthquakes or the tornadoes and the hurricanes and the monsoons and things of that nature, whatever it happens to be, right? People don't understand any of that. Right, but the more you come into possession of knowledge through your own understanding, through your own empirical insights, as you apply your senses, you apply your five faculties to interpret and understand the world around you, the more you appreciate that there are meaningful explanations that don't necessarily rely upon superstitious nonsense which the church wants you to believe in. And so I think that this is the foundation of a secular state, whereby there is a need, an imperative to separate the church from the state. Because Voltaire would probably have us believe that the church is not really a good thing. The church serves to inhibit and restrain and undermine the collective development, the collective intellectual development of society as a whole, because it is not in furtherance of the church's interest to ensure that the people are maximally educated and they have as many insights as they possibly can as derived from their understanding of science and the laws of nature, the laws of the universe as we understand them. No, that's antithetical to the church, what the church wants. And what I mean by what the church wants is what I mean by the church of the 18th century, the church of the early 19th century. Now I'm talking about the 21st century Catholic Church. But the 18th and 19th century church was very, very much concerned about people becoming enlightened, because the more enlightened they are, the more they might begin to question the prerogative of the church to be able to tell them, you have to do these various things in accordance with the law of God. And indeed, the more people may begin to challenge whether or not the scripture actually is authentic, whether or not the church has the right, the sole exclusive prerogative of interpreting what the scripture actually means, right? Because Luther, think about it this way, Luther himself, Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant Reformation, right? He was a very educated man. He wouldn't have had the ideas that he had to challenge the prevailing authority of the Catholic Church, but for the fact that he himself was enlightened. So this all goes to make the point, or in furtherance of making the point, that Secularism is inextricably related, the secular state, the aspiration to have a more secular state. And the secular state just means a state that doesn't have the constraints of religion. It's a separation of church and state. That church is not dictating to the state what the state ought to do and how the state ought to behave and the moral import and the moral implications of these state actors and so on and so forth. That they're completely dissociated, they're completely disconnected, they are mutually exclusive. They do not overlap. Or in the words of Stephen Jay Gould, they are non-overlapping magisteria. The very beautiful, very eloquent words of Stephen Jay Gould. And he, of course, he was talking about not state and not church and state. He was talking about religion and science. They are non-overlapping magisteria, meaning that they deal with separate things. They concern themselves with separate ideas and separate notions that are governed by separate laws, right? That they can't necessarily, you can't conflate the two, because when you conflate the two, it's like crossing the streams in Ghostbusters and the whole world ends, right? So this is the assertions. These are the assertions of Voltaire. Now, along comes John Locke. Along comes John Locke. And John Locke writes a treatise, and a treatise is just a book which is, it has a particular purpose, a particular function, and usually it has a very narrow sort of thesis, or a very narrow idea or abstraction or concept that it's going to examine and elucidate. And you have treatises on law, for instance, right? You have treatises written about constitutional law, right? Well, this was a philosophical treatise that addressed itself. It was called Two Treatises of Government. It was written by this guy by the name of John Locke, and it addressed itself to an earlier work by this guy named Robert Filmer. It was actually a reply or a rebuttal to this work by this guy named Robert Filmer. And Robert Filmer wrote this book called Patriarcha, okay, or Patriarchy, right? Just Latin for patriarchy. And in Patriarcha, Robert Filmer asserts he makes the case for the divine right of kings. Okay. Now, Robert Filmer is a conservative. All right. True to core, in his heart and his mind, his innermost conviction is conservative. And he's making the case, essentially, in Patriarcha, right, or Patriarchy, right? He's making the case that monarchs have this irrefragable, this undeniable right that flows, that has a incontrovertible pedigree, right? A pedigree that is beyond that is unsullied, right? And that the divine right of kings is something that comes all the way back down from Adam, okay? And you can trace this all the way back to the origins of mankind, all the way back to Genesis, and that the kings can essentially trace their lineage, the kings of the world, the kings of the modern world. So argues Filmer in this Patriarchy. He argues that the kings of the modern world can trace their ancestral lineage, their bloodlines and their inheritance and their family trees. It's like they can go on to Ancestry.com, and if they give enough money to Ancestry.com and they go back far enough, they can actually look up their family tree. And at the the first root, the first branch of the family tree, well, before the branches, we'd say the seed of the family tree is Adam, okay? Or so asserts Robert Filmer. And he says, if that in fact is the case, right, think about the relationship that Adam had to God, and that Adam subsequently had to creation. Adam was charged by God to be an overlord of creation. That creation was subject to Adam. That Adam was superior to creation because he was man, he was sapient, he was a thinking being. He was therefore intrinsically superior to the rest of creation. And if you trace the lineage, if you trace the inheritors, the legacy of Adam, you go down to Noah, you go down to Shem and Ham and the other sons of Noah, and you go down all through the various ancient Judaic prophets and so on and so forth. And eventually you can trace that to the modern kings. You can trace that to the founders of the Merovingian dynasty in France. You can trace that back down to the Hohenzollern family and the various families, the aristocratic families, the governing families of Europe. So goes the argument of Robert Filmer in Patriarchy. And he says that if in fact it is the case that Adam had overlordship in relation to creation, well then that is the prerogative that comes down, that precedent, if you will, right? That is the precedent that God established. God established that precedent, and kings stand in relation to their subjects as Adam stood in relation to the creation of the Garden of Eden. right? And he can go out there and he can pick apples from a tree. He can eat apples, or he's not supposed to do that, right? But he can go out there and he can hunt the chipmunks, right? Or he can hunt the rabbits, or he can go out there and brutalize the animals. So he can go hunt birds and do whatever he wants, right? He can go pick grass and cut down some trees or something like that. That's the idea, right? And so it was with Adam. And this is sort of the primordial man, and this is the template, because this all presupposes that we're all a bunch of good Christians and we all understand biblical scholarship and we all appreciate the value of the metaphor that's associated with the teachings of Genesis, and that we draw this analogy between Adam and the modern kings, the kings of modern Europe in the 18th and 19th century. And we say that the kings, because they are the inheritors of the legacy of Adam, as his legacy can be traced back down through the generations, through the progeny of the sons of Noah and through Noah and then all the way back up to Adam, then it's fair to say that the kings have assumed the mantle of responsibility to dictate and control unilaterally the affairs of this world, and they therefore have control and jurisdiction, complete unrestricted jurisdiction over all the sorts of things that inhabit this world, including human beings. That is the argument of Robert Filmer. That is the argument, the primary thesis of patriarchy. Now, John Locke comes along and he says that's a bunch of horseshit, right? He says that doesn't sound very accurate. He says, well, before I get to what John Locke says, the other point that that Robert Filmer makes, he says that kings are in many ways, kings are kind of like God, right? You have to analogize kings to God because the authority that kings receive comes from God. They are anointed by the church in furtherance of promulgating laws and ruling in the interests of God. And so therefore they are kind of like the Pope. They are the vicars of Christ. They are the representatives of God in this temporal world. And if in fact that is the case, and if you look at how God stands, this is the argument of Fillmore, right? If you look at how God stands in relation to humanity, God makes laws. He makes natural laws for the universe, right? That he himself is not beholden to. Okay, this is a basic sort of ontological philosophical precept when you go into discussions between atheists and theists, is that God is the promulgator of laws. He is the creator. He is the being. He's the alpha and the omega, right? He's the end and and everything that exists, right? The beginning and the end. And because God is all those things, right, he's all things to all people, he is not bound by the laws which he imposes upon the things which he creates, which include human beings. And if the argument is that kings are in many ways sort of synonymous to, or God is a metaphor for the relationship that kings have with human beings, God is to creation as a king is to the citizens whom he rules over. And if you continue to follow that analogy and you carry it to its natural conclusion, well, then you have to say, because God is not bound by the laws which he promulgates and he holds all the things that he creates to, right? Then therefore the king is not bound to the laws which he himself promulgates and yet imposes upon his subjects. So is it fair, therefore, in accordance with the teachings and the writings, the philosophical ruminations of Filmer, is it fair for a king to say that thou shalt not murder in the kingdom of France? And yet the king reserves unto himself the sole prerogative to go out there and cut people's heads off with the guillotine. Is that fair in accordance with the writings, the ruminations of Filmer in this patriarchy? Yes, that's perfectly consistent, right? The king can make laws that he therefore imposes upon other people, and he holds them accountable to those laws, but yet he himself is immune to his own laws, right? He is the lawmaker. It's kind of like Hammurabi, right? You guys probably don't know anything about Hammurabi, but I spent a lot of time talking about him in the class which precedes this, Western Civilization Part 1. And Hammurabi made laws. He was known as the lawgiver. He was an ancient king of Mesopotamia. And he made laws. But of course, Hammurabi tried to hold himself accountable to his own laws, right? Now, that's not what Filmer is saying. He's saying there's basically a double standard, right? It's what they tell you not to do in military academy. If you're an officer, if you're a commanding officer, right? They tell you not to say, do as I say, not as I do, right? You don't want to be the kind of leader who relies upon that kind of mantra, right? Do as I say, not as I do, because that means necessarily by that you're basically asserting is that there is a double standard, right? That I tell you what to do and then I do something completely different, right? That's the kind of relationship I have with my girlfriend, actually, right? She has, it's do as I say, Jeff, not as I do, okay? She holds herself to a completely different standard than she holds me. I think that's probably true in a lot of relationships, but especially true in mine. Now, John Locke comes along and he writes this treatise, okay, and it's called The Two Treatises of Government, okay, and it is a response, it is a rebuttal or a refutation of patriarcha written by Robert Filmer. Filmer's the conservative, Locke is the neo-progressive, I suppose you could say, because he's sort of foreshadowing some of the arguments that the liberals will develop a little later on. And he says with respects to the argument about Adam, there's a couple of problems, right? Because if you say that the divine prerogative of kings derives from, is derivative of their capacity to trace back their ancestral heritage and their lineage all the way back to Adam, the first problem is you'd really need a very huge, sort of massive supercomputer that's processing terabytes of information every millisecond to be able to go back and to be able to retrace, run the tape back, rewind the tape of human history back with such a level of minutia in terms of detail, the level of microscopic detail to be able to definitively and authoritatively ascertain the extent to which modern day kings in the 1800s are actually relations of, distant relations or ancestors of Noah and his sons, and even before that, going all the way back to Adam. He's basically saying, think about the impossibility of that, or at least the improbability of that. Now, that seems to me to be a very good argument, right? Because think about how much genetic testing has evolved since then. We've had the Human Genome Project since now, right? Or since then, right? The Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, the founder of the Human Genome Project, and it allows you, I think there's 23andMe as a website out there. It's a service kind of like Ancestry.com, and they got genetics.com or genetics.me or something stupid, right? And you go out there and you can basically trace your genetic origins. You could see where in Africa you originated from, right? Now, of course, if you go back far enough, we all came from the same place because we're all the same species. We all had the same starting point, right? But the point that John Locke is trying to make is that, look, even if you could do this, even if you could somehow demonstrate that, which by the way, he's not conceding that you could, right? He's saying that this would be nearly impossible, especially in the 18th century because they didn't have modern technology, they didn't have 23andMe, they didn't have supercomputers processing terabytes of data, every second. They didn't have any of this, and even now we have this, and we still can't do this, right? Because it's farcical. It's a self-defeating proposition, right? So it's the infinitesimal unlikelihood of this happening, right? To being able to definitively ascertain that a king is related to Noah, or even more fantastically, that he's related to Adam, right? So even assuming you could do that, what kind of power did Adam have in relation to creation, as God referred to it in Genesis? Did Adam have the power to go out there and to just kind of start burning down the beautiful forest there in the Garden of Eden? Did he have the power to rape and murder Eve? Could he have done that if he wanted to? No, because those were the sorts of things that the snakes were doing, right? That was the talking snake, right? That was Diablo in there, okay? Right? That was the vile and the insidious character of man. Of course, those are the sorts of things that caused Adam to lose his regnal prerogative, if you want to put it that way. It was the thing that caused Noah to lose, I mean, the loss of innocence, right? The fall of man, as it were, right? The thing that caused Adam to lose his right to be the steward and the overlord of the Garden of Eden was the fact that he disobeyed the laws of God. He decided to eat from this apple, which gave him all this universal knowledge, right? Now, if you're not permitted to do something as basic as that, something as innocuous as picking a piece of fruit off this tree over here and taking a bite out of it, right? You can't do that. Well, then there's got to be some other implicit, if not explicit, restrictions on what you can and cannot do. If in fact you are Adam, just I don't know, enjoying your time, frolicking around in the Garden of Eden. All right, you don't have the absolute right to do whatever the hell you feel like. There are certain constraints upon what you can do. You don't have overlordship over nature and creation. You are a steward and a caretaker of it. All right, that's your function in relation to nature. So argues John Locke. Right. In contrast to what Fillmore is saying, is that Adam is basically the Saddam Hussein of the ancient Garden of Eden. Right. He can go out there and he can burn things down. He can kill all the animals. He can rape Eve if he wants. Right. He can do whatever the hell he wants, and he can do so with impunity. Because you can't get to absolute monarchy, right? The absolutism of monarchy, which basically means that a monarch can do absolutely whatever he wants. You don't get to that unless you say the analogy is symmetrical. And you can't say the analogy is symmetrical unless you say that Adam can do whatever he wants. And you can't say that Adam can do whatever he wants because he couldn't even do something as innocuous, as trivial as taking an apple off a tree and taking a bite out of that, right? If he couldn't do that, there's a lot of other things that Adam couldn't do. Now, furthermore, John Locke is saying that, so argument number one is you can't trace the lineage back. It goes back too far. It's too contrived. It's too convoluted. We don't have the supercomputers to be able to trace all that data. You just can't do that empirically. You can't do that mystically. You can't do that in any other way, right? It's not feasible. You can't do it, okay? Secondly, the power that Adam had vis-a-vis creation in the Garden of Eden was not dictatorial, totalitarian, autocratic, absolute power. It was a power that was qualified. There were certain stipulations and caveats and constraints placed on his power in relation to creation in the Garden of Eden. Okay? And if in fact you are to follow that analogy, then so too must it be the case that kings are like Adam. If you're going to say that the analogy is like Adam, the metaphor is like Adam, that's the completion of the metaphor, well then come full circle and don't be disingenuous to the facts as they are. Well then kings, much like Adam, can do certain things, right? They can be stewards of their subjects. They can look after their subjects. They can water the plants. They can feed the ducks. They can feed the geese. They can feed the animals, right? They can do all that, right? They can feed the king can feed the provision and feed his people, and he can be a good king, an enlightened king, a just king, a fair king. But he can't go out there in Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler or Stalin fashion and just arbitrarily start killing people. Right? But so says Fillmore. He says, well, you can do whatever the hell you want, right? You got this prerogative, you got this divine power, which metaphorically derives from the power, the overlordship that Adam had. Well, I think Locke is making a pretty convincing argument here, and I'm more on the Locke side of the house than I am on the Fillmore side of the house at this point. So what else does Locke say? He says that he says that we basically need, we meaning the people of France and the people of other European countries that are government monarchs, we have to repudiate this idea of the absolute monarch, because the absolute monarch is only absolute in his authority to the extent that his authority is derived from God. And if you dispossess him of the prerogative that devolves from God granting him the absolute right to be the overlord over his subjects, if you say that, well, this metaphor with Adam is actually rather suspect, it's a bit sketchy, it's a bit shady, it's a bit lacking in authenticity and a bit historically anachronistic. If you challenge the veracity of that, then I think what Locke is saying is that you have to undermine the credibility of the assertion that monarch's power, the power of an absolute monarch, is predicated on the divine right of that monarch to assume complete autocratic control and be a dictator unto his subjects, be a god amongst insects, in the words of Magneto from X-Men Part 2. And so I think that Locke is basically saying, I mean, he's already made the case that this Adam metaphor doesn't work out. And he's saying that it therefore follows that if you repudiate empirically and logically and coherently, right, you repudiate the Adam metaphor, well, absolute monarchy is predicated on the idea that the absolute power of the monarch is derivative from God, and that itself presupposes that the monarch is in fact a direct but very distant ancestor of Adam, and that Adam has this command authority over nature in the Garden of Eden. Well, all of that is completely negated now, okay? And therefore there is no divine right to rule, and therefore the monarch cannot be autocratic, he cannot be dictatorial, and therefore the power of the monarch devolves under the state. The state supersedes the power of the monarch. And the monarch is therefore not the promulgator of laws, not the maker of laws arbitrarily as he sees fit, just like God, because that was the metaphor that Fillmore rather, I think, inappropriately chose to use, right? But it's no longer, he's no longer the supreme authority, because the laws must come from the highest authority in the state. And if you say that the monarch is no longer the highest supreme authority because his prerogative to rule, as it was predicated on the divine right of kings, that is overthrown. We've repudiated that very thoroughly. Well, then you have to say that the state in and of itself has to have the power, has to have the authority, has to be able to usurp and supplant the monarch which came before it. And how do you do that? Well, you have to say the state is essentially an extension of the people, the will of the people. The state represents the collective will of the people. Now, can you have a sovereign state? Can you have a state which essentially takes the place of a sovereign monarch? Because before we talked about monarchs and how monarchs were sovereign, they were sovereign in the sense that they could do whatever the hell they want. They weren't bound to or constrained by a legislature or the will of the people or the dictates of precedents or anything like that. Well, can a state be sovereign? Can you have a sovereignty of a state? Yes, you can. But the sovereignty of the state essentially relies upon the consent of the people. And that's fundamentally the point that is being made. And the consent of the people comes back to this notion of social contract theory. Now, what is social contract theory? If you remember all the way back when a few weeks ago I was talking about Rousseau, okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another French philosopher. And social contract theory essentially stipulates that people in a state of nature have all sorts of liberties. We have complete unfettered freedom. And too much freedom is a very bad thing because too much freedom allows me to do whatever I want, right? Too much freedom is just to say I have complete control, I have complete right, the complete unfettered right to exercise whatever prerogative I want to exercise, right? So I'm not constrained by any force, by any precedent, by any sort of moral standard whatsoever, right? And social contract theory basically says that we surrender, we collectively, citizens of a state, surrender certain rights, certain liberties, so we don't have absolute, unadulterated, 100%, 100 proof freedom, because that's a bad thing, because that just results in a state of nature, right? And social contract is not a state of nature. So social contract is an effort to avoid a state of nature, right? State of nature is total freedom, right? 100% freedom. And you may say, well, that's a good thing. Isn't that the point that Rousseau was making, right? That state of nature is the best thing ever, because that goes all the way back when things were more egalitarian, they were more fair, and they were more balanced. There wasn't property. It predates the formulation of property, and it predates materialism and consumerism and all that sort of thing. Well, yeah, but it also predates the idea of the rule of law, and it also presupposes that mankind is intrinsically good. But if you don't presuppose that, or if you think you find out otherwise, you find out the hard way that mankind is intrinsically bad, or if he's just kind of, ambivalent, well, then the state of nature is going to be a very bad thing, right? Because it just means that the strongest will survive, and they will persist, and they will perpetuate their genes, and they will subjugate and control and lord over the weak. And that's never a good thing, okay? So you have to have the people surrender some degree of liberty so as to ensure a collective sense of security. And this goes back to a fundamental question, which you guys are completely entitled to examine in great detail if, in fact, you undertake that extra credit assignment and you do it under the auspices of political science. What is the relationship between security and freedom? Think about that, and think about how that relationship is in many ways, I think, plays out in the context of COVID, right? To what extent was security advanced and liberty was circumscribed? Or think about it back in 2001 in the promulgation of the Patriot Act, right, which gave certain powers to the TSA, whom we all love because they got the latex gloves and they do the full anal body cavity searches when you go to the airport. And if you're wearing a long beard and you're reciting things that the Prophet Muhammad said, then you're probably going to be subjected to that kind of interrogation. But the fundamental idea behind social contract theory is that if in fact we have what is the contract? Well, the contract is between the people, the vox populi, as they're known as in Latin, which is just the citizenry collectively, the citizens of a state, right? All the citizens collectively and individually essentially have this is not an actual contract, it's sort of a metaphorical contract, right? They have a metaphorical contract with the state, with the government of the state. And the idea is that the people will behave themselves and they will surrender certain rights. They will surrender the idea of absolute liberty. So they're not going to go out there and infringe upon the interests and the rights of their neighbor, right? They're not going to do that. And in return, they're going to respect the power of the state. The state has certain power, and the state must have certain power so as to ensure that the people are being held to an acceptable degree of conduct, and enforces the norms of the society as sort of reified and reinforced by cultural values. And so that's basically what the social contract entails. So this is in many ways, this is a progressive idea. It is a idea that is born about as a consequence of liberal ideology and liberal philosophy. Now, why do I say that? Because conservatives don't believe in any of this, right? They don't say there's a social contract. There is no contract, right? There's no contract at all, right? It's the king just does unilaterally whatever the hell he wants. And that's there's no qualification to that, right? It's categorical power, right? And so you don't get to social contract theory unless you presume that people have the capacity to be rational, to be intelligent, to be fair, to be just, to be good, to restrain themselves from their bestial instincts, right? And to therefore immerse themselves in philosophical enlightenment principles, and to become more educated and erudite, and therefore to have a greater appreciation for the value of human life and the value of human liberty, and therefore to be less inclined to actually savagely infringe upon those things. So this really does harken back to what I was talking about before. I mean, this to just tie this all up right now, because I know this is actually ironic. The one time that I told you guys I wasn't going to circumscribe this video to less than an hour and 53 minutes is the one time that I'm going to make sure that it's not going to be more than an hour and a half, because I'm literally falling. I'm trying very hard not to fall asleep right now. I'm that tired, and it's like 9 o'clock, and I'm probably going to go to bed here in like the next 20 minutes. But to tie this all together, so if you think about what one of the first points that I made here, which is to say that we assume that knowledge is a good thing, because knowledge is a form of human empowerment. It makes us, it grants us the ability as human beings to have a greater appreciation and regard, and therefore reverence and understanding for our fellow human beings. And the greater we can understand and appreciate other people that may be like us, that may be dissimilar from us, the greater we can commiserate with them. The greater we can appreciate and understand them, the greater we can relate to them, the less likely we are going to arbitrarily infringe upon their rights and their liberties, because we commiserate with them, because we identify with them, because we wouldn't want them doing that to us, right? And so education and enlightenment are absolutely quintessential. They are indispensable. If you assume that the fundamental human nature, which may be good, it may be bad, regardless of what you assume, but even if you assume it's bad, right, especially if you assume it's bad, then you have to tame the savagery of the beast, right? And the beast is you and I, okay? Or so says conservative philosophy, right? And the liberals come along and they say, yeah, we'll tame you, right? We'll tame you with enlightenment principles, and we'll edify the mind, and we'll enrich your life, and we'll make you a better person. We'll make you a more wholesome person, a person who is more able to properly and civilly interface with the vox populi, society as a whole, and we all can live together in perfect harmony as a result of our comprehensive understanding of the values and the rights of one another. Well, so says the liberal ideology, the liberal progressive thesis. And I think that this really does segue into the final point that I was making about this notion that social contract is something that we have the capacity to create. This contract, we the citizenry, in and of ourselves, by virtue of us being enlightened individuals, by virtue of us having intrinsic worth, by virtue of us having the capacity to become smarter and more educated, and therefore have a greater appreciation for the rights and liberties of other people, and therefore not arbitrarily infringe upon them. Well, if we're able to do that, certainly we can understand that the state, we have to surrender certain prerogatives so that the state can rule over us in a manner that is just and maintains order and civility amongst all of us collectively. Certainly we can understand and appreciate that, right? So again, liberalism does sort of presume a certain good faith inclination on behalf of humanity. That human beings want to do good, right? Maybe that we're not always good, but that we want to do good. If given the opportunity, that we will do good, and if given the opportunity to learn and become more informed and become more enlightened, we will become more informed, we will become more enlightened. I don't know if you can always assume that. You certainly can't always assume that, because there are no categorical rules in this world, and there's certainly no categorical rules when we're talking about philosophy and intellectual history. But I think what you can say is that people are generally more inclined to be more civil if in fact they understand the rights and the needs and the prerogatives of other people, because they're more likely to commiserate with them. So I think that is a point that we have to at least concede. That's a point that I think actually has traction here. Now, I guess we could go and talk about how Napoleon was in many ways sort of symbolic of the promulgation of these liberal ideologies, and how progressive philosophy really gained traction in Europe as a result of the conquest of Napoleon, because he was trying to promulgate these ideas, because he thought that he was essentially the harbinger of the revolution. In a way, he was sort of masquerading as that, but in actuality, he was something completely different, because he was an autocrat, but he just wanted people to believe that he was the bringer of libertarian ideology. I'm not going to talk about that, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to let you guys, well, I'm not going to let you guys go, because maybe you're not even listening to me anymore. I don't know how many of you actually listen. I try to go through and I do the analytics on these videos, but they're not very encouraging, because what they tell me is that like the average view time is something like 25 minutes, and these videos are what, an hour and 53 minutes. So what is that? That's 100. That's like 133 minutes or something, right? And so if you're only watching like 20% of it, well, you're probably only getting 20% worth of the video, okay? And so you deserve to get a 20% on the next exam if that's in fact the case. Well, I think it would logically follow, absolutely, right? Maybe not axiomatically, maybe not actually, but it would logically follow, at least in theory. Okay, I think that's all I've got for you guys today. Again, if you want, if you got any questions concerning the extra credit, I really do sincerely want you guys to give it very serious consideration. I think it's going to be worth your while. I can't promise you that you'll earn all the credit on the extra credit because that's obviously going to depend on how good of a paper you write for me. But if you take it seriously, if you really invest your time and your effort and you do it, make a good faith effort to go out there and make some kind of inquiry into something that appeals to your intellectual sensibilities, and you come back and give me some good insights, chances are you'll probably get full credit. And chances are, well, look, if you need the points because you're on the precipice, because you're on the border of failing, then don't do yourself the disservice. Don't forego this opportunity. Okay, it is an insurance policy against your failing the course. And if you don't need the points, maybe there will come a time in the future when you do need the points, right? Because you have no idea what's going to be on the final exam, and you won't know until it comes out. But by that time, the extra credit will already have been due. So you will have dispossessed yourself the opportunity to do it. So it's better to have that in your back pocket if in case you do find that the final exam is a substantial undertaking and maybe you don't know what the hell I'm talking about and maybe you don't do as well as you would hoped. So I think either way, it is a safeguard against possibly compromising your status in this class, academically speaking. I would strongly recommend that you give it serious consideration. If you got any questions about it, please, you guys know how to get a hold of me. That's all I've got for you guys today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. I will talk to you guys on Wednesday.